You won't believe what happened inside that office on a quiet Wednesday afternoon, because sometimes the ugliest truths about how people treat others come to the surface when no one expects it. Imagine being a hardworking woman, giving your best every single day, staying late to finish reports, never complaining about overtime, and still keeping a smile on your face just to show gratitude for the opportunity you have. Now imagine doing all that. But instead of respect, instead of even basic decency, you are met with insults, sneers, and even physical humiliation in front of your coworkers. That's exactly what happened to Vanessa, a brilliant black woman who had fought her way into a corporate office where she was one of the only people of color. From day one, she felt the silent stares, the whispered comments, the way her ideas, in meetings, were brushed aside until someone else repeated them. She felt the looks at her natural hair, the sighs when she spoke confidently, the subtle but sharp reminders that she didn't really belong in their world. But Vanessa was strong. She had built her character on resilience. She had grown up in a small town, raised by a mother who worked 2 jobs just to put food on the table. And she promised herself that no matter how hard it got, she would not be the kind of person who let others dictate her worth. What she didn't know was that her strength would be tested in a way so humiliating, so cruel, that it would take everything in her not to break down in tears at her desk. And yet what those cruel co-workers didn't know either was that behind Vanessa stood a man whose very name carried weight across the nation. A man with power, resources, and a protective love so fierce that when he learned what had happened, the entire office's world would come crashing down. It all began with something as simple as a can of Coca-Cola, carelessly, deliberately, and maliciously thrown on her in front of everyone. The day started like any other, and that was part of the reason why what happened was so shocking. Vanessa had walked into the office early, like she always did, clutching her coffee in one hand and balancing a stack of neatly prepared reports in the other. She loved her work, no matter how much shade her co-workers threw her way, because she believed every task was a stepping stone toward the future she wanted to build. She greeted the receptionist with a warm smile, nodded politely to the interns, and sat at her desk ready to begin. Her focus was unmatched, and that's partly why some of her colleagues secretly resented her. They couldn't understand how she managed to keep her head high even when people tried to bring her down. But resentment has a way of festering, and in that particular office, a toxic little group had been whispering for weeks, planning petty ways to put her in her place. It wasn't because she had done anything wrong, it was because she was excelling, because she didn't crack under pressure, because she had a dignity that made their cruel jokes bounce off her. The ringleader of that group was a woman named Stacy, someone who always felt threatened by Vanessa's calm confidence. Stacy was used to being the center of attention, but Vanessa's presence shifted the dynamic and she couldn't stand it. So when lunch rolled around and everyone gathered in the break room, Stacy made her move. She held a can of Coca-Cola in her hand, shaking it up while laughing with 2 of her closest allies. And in front of the entire room, without warning, she popped the tab, letting the fizz explode, and hurled it straight at Vanessa. The cold, sticky liquid splashed across Vanessa's blouse, dripping down her skirt, soaking her papers, while the room erupted into stunned silence, followed by cruel laughter. For a moment, Vanessa froze. It wasn't just the soda. It was the symbolism, the degradation, the way they had tried to strip her of her dignity in front of everyone. Some people laughed nervously, others looked away, but no one stood up for her. That was the cruelest part. She was left standing there, drenched in soda, her hands trembling, her heart racing, while Stacy smirked like she had just won some kind of sick game. And yet, Vanessa didn't scream. She didn't curse. She didn't cry. She simply looked Stacy in the eye, took a slow breath, and began calmly blotting the soda from her blouse with napkins. But what no one in that room realized was that Vanessa wasn't just some ordinary woman they could humiliate without consequence. She was married to one of the most powerful billionaires in the country, a man who loved her beyond measure and who would stop at nothing to protect her from cruelty. And fate would arrange it so that he walked into that very office just minutes after the incident, turning the entire story upside down. The sound of that Coca-Cola can hitting Vanessa and spraying across the room lingered in the air like an echo of cruelty. But before the humiliation could fully settle in, something happened that nobody expected. The glass doors of the office swung open, and in walked a man whose presence immediately shifted the atmosphere. Tall, sharply dressed in a tailored navy suit, with an aura of quiet authority that commanded attention, it was none other than David Hamilton, Vanessa's husband. To most of the employees, the name alone carried weight. He was a billionaire investor, the kind of man whose face was occasionally on magazine covers, who appeared on television networks discussing economic trends, whose signature could make or break entire companies. He wasn't the sort of person anyone expected to see casually strolling into a mid-level corporate office. But there he was, holding a bouquet of flowers in one hand and a warm smile on his face, because he had planned to surprise Vanessa with lunch. At first, no one connected the dots. People simply gawked, murmuring among themselves, wondering what someone of his stature was doing there. But the moment his eyes landed on Vanessa, standing there soaked in soda, napkins clutched in her trembling hands, her blouse ruined, her dignity bruised, that warm smile vanished in an instant. His jaw tightened, his eyes darkened, and his entire posture shifted from gentle to protective in a heartbeat. What happened here? His voice cut through, the silence like a blade. It wasn't raised, but the controlled fury in it made even the most arrogant employees stiffen in fear. Vanessa, still in shock, tried to shake her head, to brush it off, whispering, "It's fine, David, please." But David wasn't the type of man to look away from injustice, especially not when it came to the woman he loved more than life itself. He set the flowers down on her desk, took off his jacket, and walked slowly toward the group of employees still huddled near the break room. His eyes locked on Stacy, who had frozen in place, her smirk faltering as the reality of the situation settled in. "Who did this?" he asked, his voice low, steady, but laced with such intensity that everyone felt a shiver run down their spines. No one answered. Some glanced nervously at Stacy, others stared at the floor, unwilling to get involved. David scanned the room, reading every expression, every nervous twitch, until his gaze landed back on Stacy. She stammered, It was just a joke." That was the moment the room truly shifted. David stepped closer, towering over her, his expression hardening. "You think humiliating a woman like this is a joke?" His tone was calm, but the silence that followed was deafening. Everyone could feel the storm brewing beneath his composed exterior, and in that moment, they all realized something terrifying. This wasn't just a man defending his wife. This was a billionaire whose influence stretched far beyond that office. A man who could change lives with a single decision. And as he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, everyone understood that their careers, their reputations, even the company itself, might be seconds away from destruction, because David wasn't going to let this go. Not for a second. The air in the office grew heavy, as though every molecule in the room could feel the shift from ordinary workplace chatter to something monumental, something that people would remember for the rest of their lives. David didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence was enough to command silence. The employees who had been laughing only moments earlier now stood frozen, their eyes darting between him and Stacy, who was beginning to shrink under the weight of his glare. Vanessa, still standing by her desk, whispered, "David, please, don't make a scene," but her words barely carried in the charged stillness. David turned slightly toward her, his expression softening only for a heartbeat, as he looked at her soaked clothes and the soda-stained reports she had worked so hard on. In that single glance, there was pain, there was anger, but most of all, there was love. And then, as though flipping a switch, he turned back to the room with a chilling calmness that made even the bravest employees swallow hard. "Everyone, listen carefully," he said, slipping his phone back into his pocket. "I don't tolerate disrespect, not in my world, and especially not toward my wife." A ripple of realization spread across the office. Whispers grew louder. His wife? Vanessa? She's married to him? The revelation stunned them. The very woman they mocked, the one they dismissed, the one they thought they could humiliate without consequence, was connected to a man whose wealth and influence could end careers in an instant. David let that sink in before continuing. "You thought it was funny to throw a drink on her, to humiliate her in front of everyone, to laugh while she stood there drenched. Tell me, where's the humor now?" His words dripped with controlled fury, every syllable like a hammer driving nails into the coffin of their arrogance. Stacy opened her mouth to defend herself, but the words caught in her throat. She had built her little kingdom of gossip and cruelty, but now she stood before someone who could dismantle not just her job, but her entire professional reputation. David reached into his jacket pocket again and pulled out a sleek black pen. "I happen to have a controlling stake in this company," he announced, and gasps filled the room. "That means your little games end today. Effective immediately, every single person who stood by and laughed, every single one who thought this was entertainment, you're fired." The words hit like a thunderclap. People's faces drained of color. Some tried to protest. Others stuttered excuses. But David silenced them with a single raised hand. "No, don't bother. I watched your faces. I saw who laughed. You don't deserve to sit in this office, to collect a paycheck from a company built on values you clearly don't understand. And Stacy," he said, turning his full attention to her, "you will never step foot in this industry again if I have anything to say about it." Tears welled in her eyes as the weight of his words crushed her arrogance. She tried to mutter, "It was just a joke." But David cut her off. "Jokes don't destroy dignity. Jokes don't strip a person of their humanity. This wasn't a joke. It was cruelty. And cruelty has consequences." The silence was absolute. Every employee knew this wasn't just a firing. This was a reckoning. Vanessa, still shaken, touched David's arm gently, as though reminding him to breathe. But he wasn't finished. Not yet. He wanted every single person in that office to remember this day. Not as the day they laughed at Vanessa, but as the day they learned what happens when you cross a woman whose worth was far greater than their small-minded cruelty. The office was no longer the same space it had been only minutes before. Where once there had been the hum of chatter, clicking keyboards, and casual laughter, there was now only silence, broken occasionally by the nervous shuffling of feet or the sharp intake of breath from someone realizing the reality of what David had just declared. To be fired on the spot was one thing, but to be told by a man of his stature, in a voice filled with such certainty and finality, that their careers were effectively over, that was something no one in that room had ever imagined could happen. Stacy's allies, who had been giggling with her when she shook the can of soda, stood pale and trembling. They glanced at each other, at Stacy, then back at David, as if hoping someone would step in, hoping this was just a scare tactic. But David's expression made it clear he wasn't bluffing. His influence stretched far beyond those glass walls. A word from him could end contracts, ruin reputations, and close doors in every direction. People who had once thought of Vanessa as just another colleague, someone easy to dismiss or mock, suddenly saw her in a different light. Not because of David's wealth alone, but because his presence illuminated something they had ignored. Her strength, her dignity, the quiet resilience that had always made her stand out. Now, they were forced to reckon with the ugliness of their own actions. One man near the back tried to mumble an apology, stammering, I didn't. Laugh, I swear I was just... But David's gaze cut him down instantly. If you didn't stand up for her, you're just as guilty. Those words echoed like a judgment none of them could escape. And in truth, he was right. Every person in that room had made a choice. To laugh, to stay silent, to turn away. And that silence was as sharp as any insult. Vanessa's hands were still trembling as she tried to dab the sticky soda from her blouse, her eyes darting nervously around the room. She had always been strong, always carried herself with pride. But in that moment, she felt both the weight of humiliation and the astonishing wave of protection David had unleashed for her sake. Part of her wanted to tell him to stop, to let it go, because she wasn't used to anyone fighting battles on her behalf. But another part of her, the part that had swallowed years of microaggressions, of dismissive comments, of the quiet cruelty of being othered in her own workplace, felt an overwhelming surge of relief. For once, someone wasn't telling her to be the bigger person. For once, someone wasn't asking her to brush it off, to just keep smiling and proving her worth. For once, someone had looked at the injustice and said enough. David took a slow step back, surveying the room. You've all forgotten the simplest rule of any workplace, respect. You thought you could strip my wife of her dignity for sport. You thought no one would ever hold you accountable. But today, you're learning something you should have known all along. Every action has consequences. His words landed like stones, each one sinking into the hearts of those who had thought cruelty could be passed off as humor. Stacy, tears streaming down her cheeks now, collapsed into a chair, muttering incoherently, her arrogance completely shattered. Her allies were no better, faces red, lips quivering, the bravado drained from their bodies. But David wasn't finished yet. He pulled out his phone once more and dialed a number. Yes, he said calmly when the line connected. This is Hamilton. I need HR and legal down here immediately. We'll be terminating several contracts effective today. The sound of those words made stomachs drop. This wasn't just theater. This wasn't just an angry husband storming in and making empty threats. This was happening. Lives were about to change forever because of a single cruel act. And though fear rippled through the room, there was also something else. Respect. For Vanessa. For the woman who had stood tall through their mockery, who now stood beside a man who saw her worth more clearly than anyone else ever had. The room felt like it had frozen in time. Every set of eyes locked on David as he paced slowly across the office floor, each footstep echoing with the kind of authority that could not be faked or challenged. Vanessa stood quietly, still trying to process the chaos of the last few minutes, her blouse sticky, her pride bruised, but her spirit unbroken. She looked at her husband with a mixture of awe and worry, because while she admired the ferocity of his defense, she also knew this moment would ripple outward far beyond these walls. Employees whispered in low voices, some with shame written across their faces, others with fear about what tomorrow might bring. But for David, tomorrow wasn't the concern. What mattered was right now. The moment his wife was disrespected, the moment cruelty was allowed to masquerade as humor, the moment silence became complicity, and he would not let that stand. HR and legal soon arrived, their expressions stiff, as they realized the gravity of the situation. Effective immediately, David declared, handing over a handwritten list of names. The following employees are terminated for gross misconduct and violation of workplace standards. He didn't read the names aloud, but the sound of pens scratching on paper, the shuffling of documents, and the hushed tones of HR confirming his authority was enough to send chills through the office. Those whose names appeared on the list, slumped in their seats, faces pale, knowing their careers were crumbling before their eyes. Stacy tried one last desperate plea, her voice cracking as she sobbed. "Please, it was a mistake. I didn't mean it. I'll apologize. I'll—" But David held up a hand, silencing her with the kind of controlled power that made her words evaporate. "You didn't think of consequences when you humiliated her. You didn't think of apologies when you laughed. Now it's too late. Actions have consequences, and this is yours." His tone wasn't cruel. It was final, resolute, undeniable. Vanessa, unable to stand the sight of so many people unraveling before her, gently touched his arm again, whispering softly, "David, maybe that's enough." Her voice trembled with both gratitude and compassion, because despite everything, she still had the heart to feel pity for those who had wronged her. He turned to her, his face softening for the first time since he walked into the office. "Enough?" he asked quietly. She nodded, her eyes shimmering with emotion. In that moment, he realized she didn't need a battlefield cleared in her honor. What she needed was simply to know she wasn't alone. He exhaled, letting some of the fury drain from him, and addressed the room one final time. "Let this be a lesson you never forget. Respect is not optional. Dignity is not a privilege. It's a right. And if you can't treat people with humanity, you don't deserve to be here." With that, he slipped his jacket back on, picked up the flowers he had brought for her, and offered his arm. Vanessa hesitated only a moment before looping her, hand through his, soda stains and all, and together they walked toward the exit. Every pair of eyes followed them, but this time there was no laughter, no smirks, no cruel whispers. There was only silence, and perhaps a quiet recognition that they had witnessed something extraordinary. As the glass doors shut behind them, Vanessa leaned her head gently against his shoulder and whispered, "Thank you." David kissed the top of her head and replied, "You never have to thank me for protecting what I love." Outside, the city buzzed on as though nothing had happened, but inside that office, lives had changed forever. The people who had laughed at cruelty now carried the weight of shame. Those who had stayed silent knew the cost of their silence, and Vanessa, drenched in soda but wrapped in the unshakable love of her husband, walked away not as a victim, but as a woman whose dignity had been restored in the most powerful way imaginable. And to anyone watching, to anyone listening, the lesson was clear. Never mistake kindness for weakening.